there's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters this podcast was recorded on.
Hi, it's Gemma here. I'm bringing back an episode we released in 2023 about the Gabby Petito case. A new Netflix documentary series called American Murder, Gabby Petito was recently released, re-examining the final days of Petito's life and her relationship with Brian Laundrie. Gabby was a 22-year-old travel vlogger who went on a road trip with her fiancé Brian in 2021. She was reported missing on September 11 after her family lost contact and learned that Brian had actually returned to Florida alone with her van. Gabby's body was later found and Brian became the main suspect. I spoke with Sarah Arbo, now co-host of Today and a 60 Minutes reporter, about the case. Since our original episode aired, there have been some key developments. In November 2023, the Gabby Petito Act was introduced to improve law enforcement responses to domestic violence. In December of that year, court documents revealed Brian Laundrie's parents and attorney knew about Gabby's death and withheld information. And in February 2024, the Petito and Laundrie families settled a civil lawsuit, keeping the details confidential. This case shocked the nation in 2021. It was one of the most major news stories at the time. And if you're watching the series, you'll be interested in this story.
This episode of True Crime Conversations discusses themes of domestic violence and suicide. Listener discretion is advised. It's the 12th of August 2021 in the town of Moab, Utah. A passerby has just seen a young couple in a fight on the side of the road. He drives past them, but there's something disturbing about the scene he's just witnessed. So he picks up the phone and dials 911.
Hi, I'm calling. I'm right on the corner of Main Street by Moonflower, and we're driving by, and I'd like to report a domestic dispute.
What were they doing?
We drove by, and the gentleman was slapping the girl.
He was slapping her?
Yes, and then we stopped. They ran up and down the sidewalk. He proceeded to hit her, hopped in the car, and they drove off.
Moab Police Department respond to the incident that day, locating the van in question near the entrance to Arches National Park. The vehicle is owned by 22-year-old Gabby Petito, a young woman on the holiday of a lifetime with her fiancé, Brian Laundrie. The pair are 6 weeks into a 4-month cross-country trip of the United States. As they journey through some of the country's most beautiful wilderness sites, they've been living in Gabby's specially decked-out van. With dreams of becoming a travel influencer, she's been documenting, filming and posting about every adventure they've shared so far.
Me and Brian just got up and got ready, made the bed in the tent. I think our plan for today is to just hang out here in the tent. All the chocolate melted.
I know, it's a river of chocolate.
You can't keep chocolate in Utah. Not in July. Or in a clear plastic container that is always in the sun.
But the police call tells a different story to the one of joy and wanderlust on Gabby's YouTube and Instagram. On that August day in Utah, police discover a young woman in distress. Cheeks pink from being grabbed and slapped, she's crying, almost to the point of hyperventilation. The 22-year-old makes excuses as she downplays what's happened between her and Brian. She places the blame on herself.
Is there something on your cheek here? Did you get hit in the face? And then over on your arm, shoulder, right here?
Oh, yeah, I don't know.
So there's 2 people that came to us and told us that they saw him hit you.
Well, to be honest, I definitely hit him first.
Where'd you hit him?
I slapped him in the face.
You slapped him first? And then what, just on his face?
Can you get him to shut up?
How many times did you slap him?
Just a couple.
Did he hit you though? I mean, we want to know the truth if he actually hit you.
I guess, yeah, but I hit him first.
Where did he hit you?
Brian Laundrie is interviewed on the roadside separately. He jokes around with police, charms them into believing there's no danger here, convincing them that Gabby, his much shorter, narrow-framed girlfriend, is the real aggressor in this situation.
Do you mind lifting up your right sleeve for me? I'm curious about something.
But I'm not complaining. I'm not complaining.
Is it bruised or tender or anything like that?
I'm fine. I look at it. I hope she doesn't have too many complaints about me.
Gabby Petito is exhibiting what the whole world would come to see as the chillingly obvious red flags of a victim of domestic violence. Signs that were sadly missed by the responding officers. They do little to intervene that day. And after a night apart, Gabby and Brian continue on their travels. But less than a month after the incident in Moab, Gabby's family begin to fear the worst. By the time she's reported missing, Gabby Petito is already dead. I'm Emma Gillespie, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamamia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In 2021, Gabby Petito became a household name. It was her lifelong wish. But the circumstances surrounding her notoriety were a far cry from the hopes and dreams of a budding YouTuber. After Gabby and her van vanished mid-cross-country trip, her high-profile disappearance sparked an unprecedented social media movement to find her. An unstoppable onslaught of amateur sleuths and armchair detectives exposed a story no one was prepared to ignore. As the world hung on each development in the nationwide search for Gabby, her fiancé, and the truth. Our guest today, co-host of Channel 9's The Today Show and journalist Sarah Arbo, covered this case extensively for 60 minutes. She spoke to investigators, criminal profilers, and exclusively interviewed Gabby's parents. Sarah joins me today. I want to start with Gabby. You've spoken at length with her parents. What was she like? How do they describe the kind of person she was?
Yeah, it was such an incredible honour and privilege to be able to interview her parents. She's from a beautiful blended family and they are so harmonious. So her parents split when she was quite young. They had her quite young, Nicole, her mother, Joseph, her father, and have since repartnered and sort of had their separate relationships but maintained a really close relationship as a family. And so speaking to each of them to get their insight, and even from her step-parents as well, to them, Gabby was just sort of the light of their lives. I think her mum described her as a spitfire. Like just had a real energy, a real zest for life. Her dad, Joe, would often talk about how, you know, even in those early days, like as a child, she was always bringing people along for the journey. She wanted everyone to experience the best of life. She was adventurous. She was always daring. She was always the one up for the challenge, and she would always encourage people to come along with her. So from all accounts, according to her family at least, that, you know, she was a really generous soul and somebody who just enjoyed life and the beauty that's on offer.
How did she meet Brian Laundrie? How did he come into her life?
Yeah, so her and Brian went to school together, actually. So they knew each other as teenagers. And then I think they were friends. They had a similar friendship group. But it wasn't until later in life, or just after leaving school in 2019, when they became a couple. And I think because probably they had that sort of friendship history, their relationship escalated. I mean, in 2019, that's not so long ago, right? And so then they were engaged pretty quickly and then set off on this road trip together. So again, speaking with her parents about their take on Brian and what he was like, and particularly in the early stages of their relationship, I mean, her parents were just like, you know, he seemed fine, he seemed normal, he was always nice. So, yeah, for them, there didn't seem to be any sign of anything more sinister in that relationship or from him at all. They just described him as kind of a nice guy.
What do we know about their relationship in the lead up to taking this big trip? Was it the people around them, as you say, were happy for them, that he just sort of seemed like a good fit for her?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, from all accounts, they were sort of both interested in the same sorts of things, and they were both interested in the outdoors, in adventuring. This trip itself was quite collaborative. Joe helped Gabby along to purchase the van, but then Brian and Gabby pretty much put it together, really. They decked out the van according to what they would need for a road trip like this to live in comfort. So they were both really invested in the journey, and I think for them it was an opportunity of a lifetime to sort of quit their jobs and take to the world. And it was around the time, the pandemic was sort of bubbling around too. So it was sort of that escape from that mundane reality of lockdown, I guess.
And what was their presence on social media at that time? What did the world see online of the Gabby Brian love story?
Yeah, it was a very curated feed that the public got of Gabby and Brian's life, that's for sure. I think Gabby always had an interest in creating a YouTube channel, in creating a website. I don't know if we call them blogs anymore. That feels so outdated, doesn't it? But she was so keen on documenting their van life, #van life, which is a big thing, particularly in the US.
Hello, and good morning. It is really nice and sunny today.
And so for her, this trip was an opportunity to really bring the public along the ride with them. And so she was documenting all the travels, all the experiences and what life was like, living out of a van. Some of the videos are as mundane as having, her muesli in the morning and the chocolate melting in it. There's segments of that we've seen. And then obviously there's that incident when she's in the tent and it starts raining and she's got to hold it up with her hands. So there's all these little snippets of life on the road.
Coming in on me. The wind is so bad. I've just been sitting here like this for a while.
That's how we got an initial taste of them. It wasn't really until that body cam footage that we got perhaps a more accurate picture of what life was like for them on the road.
How serious was Gabby about using this trip, not just as the adventure of a lifetime, but as content creation, as an opportunity to sort of build this brand that she was hoping to make a career of?
Yeah.
And was that at odds with what Brian thought she was capable of?
The interesting part about that is I think it was both, definitely. So it was as much about the adventure as it was about curating this feed and trying to launch herself perhaps as a travel influencer or an influencer full stop. I think that's an element of it. I mean, we see that so often in today's world, right? So many people have been able to make careers out of that. I think she was trying to ride that wave. There is also that element of it actually being quite hard work. It's not just a matter of taking a photo and posting it. You've got to apply a filter. You've got to put the backing track music to it. You've got to perhaps narrate it, whatever else you want to add to it to really give it that higher production value that's worthy of a YouTube, that's worthy of the clicks that you're looking for. But one sign I think we got kind of early on that perhaps it was more difficult than either she was expecting it to be or maybe that it caused a bit of a rift in their relationship was in that body camera footage we saw Gabby say to one of the officers who was interviewing her, "He doesn't think I can do it," referring to Brian about her website.
Trying to start a blog. I have a lot of stuff. So I've been building my website. So I've been really stressed and he doesn't really believe that I could do any of it. So that's kind of been like I don't know, he's like down there. I don't know, we've just been fighting all morning and told me I needed to calm down. Yeah. But I'm perfectly calm. I'm calm all the time and he really stresses me out.
I mean, she was in such a hyper-emotional state at that point, and that's obviously something that was really weighing on her and perhaps contributed to the dysfunction in their relationship at that particular point. But I think it was really her just wanting this dream of creating a YouTube channel and being a success online and perhaps him not believing in her the way that a supportive partner should. So I think that was a bit of a fracture there that we saw.
I want to talk about that moment a little bit more. So we're 6 weeks into this trip and cracks begin to appear.
Yeah.
It starts with a bystander witnessing a fight. What can you tell me about that call to police? What was learnt about that run-in in Utah?
Yeah, so it did, as you rightly point out, start off with that 911 call. I think it was a gentleman who called 911 and he had noticed, I think the transcript is something along the lines of he slapped her and there was surprise on the end of the receiver from the 911 call. And so off the back of that, the local police were alerted and so they were on the lookout for them. So that was the first sign that we got that things weren't quite right, that perhaps this picture perfect relationship that they were presenting to the world was actually just a fabrication. This wasn't the reality that they were actually living. And so that 911 call spurred into action the police. That led then to the interrogation, I guess, by the police onto Brian and Gabby separately, trying to understand the picture. So that was the first sign we saw that there may have been domestic or family violence involved in their relationship.
Coercive control is this idea that is being spoken about a lot more and more in the media now, something we're becoming more comfortable with understanding, talking about. How did it present in that moment potentially between Gabby and Brian? I know you've spoken to experts and psychologists about that moment.
Yeah, we spoke to Laura Richards for our 60 Minutes piece, and she's red hot on all this sort of stuff. She's sort of a criminologist, but she specialises too in the area of family violence. And for her, watching back the footage captured on the body cam of the officers, it was for her as clear as black and white, that it was a classic example of coercive control. And she went so far as to say that it was the officers who greenlit Brian's behaviour. Essentially, when you're watching it, you can kind of see that it's Gabby who's in this, it's quite awful to watch actually, because she is so emotional. She's at her wit's end. She's absolutely exhausted mentally. And I think it's a sign that this had been running for some time and that she had reached almost breaking point at the time the police had pulled them over. And what you kind of get from that body cam footage is the way coercive control manifested there was that she was very defensive of him, and she was like, oh no, I hit him first, or no, we love each other, and can you please tell him I said I love him and bye, because the police had separated them at that point. So she was doing whatever she could to defend him, and he wasn't necessarily doing that. He was sort of pushing back a little bit on that, trying to be a bit more matey with the officers. And the example of coercive control is in the fact that we know the 911 call had been made, that there was some kind of violence between the couple, and then the next day you see her trying to defend him as if nothing had happened and that it was all her fault and that she'd brought it upon herself. It's sort of subtle, but we are becoming more aware of it, and for those who recognise it, it was pretty obvious in that body cam footage.
Yeah, as you mentioned, she is really distressed in that footage. The officer decides that Gabby is not at risk, refers to it as a little slap fight, and ultimately a decision is made that Brian is the victim in the situation.
You haven't admitted to striking her. She has not admitted to you striking her. The witness did not see you strike her. So at this point, you're the victim of a domestic assault. Even if you didn't want to pursue this, we don't have a choice.
How significant was that decision, that interaction, that moment? Is that a missed opportunity to save Gabby's life?
I think it's been widely viewed as a missed opportunity, yes, because even if they did see Gabby as the aggressor, which is how it landed for them, that's how they interpreted it, they separated them for the evening, right? So they put Brian in a hotel room and Gabby slept in the van alone. I mean, even that in itself is kind of staggering.
A hotel room that, if I remember correctly, was paid for by a taxpayer-funded program for victims of DV.
That's right, and they drove him there, in the comfort. And that's part of the body cam footage towards the end as well. They're having this jovial chat in the backseat as if nothing had happened. He gets to have a nice warm shower while she's stuck in the van again. And so I think the interpretation from the cops was wrong, but it's sort of, you can almost see them trying to de-escalate the situation. There's a point in there where one of them's sitting in the car and he calls a superior and he says, as you rightly point out, this is just a slap fight between a couple who otherwise love each other. So there was a sort of missed opportunity then, recognising that this may have been a bit more than that. It ultimately was more than that. If at that point they had separated them properly, if they had reported them, even if it was wrong and they reported Gabby, at the very least, despite them getting the aggressor wrong, there still would have been a report and they would have been separated for a longer period. It would have gone to a lower court and it would have been handled, according to the statute of that US state. And so the issue then becomes, why didn't it get referred? They wanted to de-escalate it. The officers thought they were doing the right thing by not dragging the couple through that process. But ultimately, if they had, then we may have had a very different outcome and Gabby could still be alive today. What that incident also raised when the officers pulled them over, that also raised a lot of questions about the training of officers and how well equipped they are to deal with domestic violence. Now, we know in Utah they had received quite a bit of training, and so it was perhaps an error in interpretation of that. And I guess that on a broader scale, you take Gabby and Brian out of the mix, it's something that we can all learn from, is really understanding domestic violence in all its different nuances and contexts, and especially when it comes to coercive control, because something like that can be so subliminal. It can be such an undercurrent in a relationship that isn't necessarily recognised. So I think it's something that, in hindsight, that officers and law enforcement generally across the US and the world will be more aware of. And if that's at least a single lesson we can take away from this, then I know for sure that the Petito family would be greatly relieved if that was a lesson.
There was a couple a short time later who crossed paths with Gabby and Brian, and you've spoken to them. What did they tell you?
Yeah, it's interesting because we spoke to them and they were likely we suspect, the last people to see Gabby alive. So that was at a Mexican restaurant in Wyoming, and they noticed a sort of an unhappy couple. I think the way it was described was that Gabby was at her wit's end. So that was Matt and Nina, and Nina in particular, said that to her it seemed as though Gabby was emotionally overwhelmed. And I feel like that's the Gabby that we saw in the body cam footage. So it kind of marries up with Nina's interpretation of what she witnessed in the restaurant that night. And if you think about that, it is alarming that despite what they'd experienced, they weren't able to kind of put the challenges they were facing as a couple aside, and it, escalated the way it did. So the fact that the public is noticing that there was a rift between them also tells us a lot about the relationship and the state of mind that they were in at that time.
We know Gabby had a really close relationship with her mum, Nicole. She was in regular contact with her every day or every other day. When did Nicole begin to worry about Gabby and her safety?
Yeah, so Nicole had been in regular contact with Gabby, so that's not to say every single day. And let's not forget that obviously travelling in van, you're always going to have reception, right, or mobile phone coverage. So it wasn't unusual to perhaps not hear each other for a day or two. It wasn't until it got to about 6 days that Nicole had not heard from Gabby and had been monitoring her social media and noticed that there weren't any posts or anything, that she became a bit worried. And that's when she reached out initially to the Laundrie family to find out, whether they'd heard from Brian and Gabby, whether they were okay, whether she could just dismiss it as them kind of, on this adventure without reception, and that's all there was to it. But she never heard back from the Laundries. They never responded to her. And so I think it got to about 10 days and she became gravely concerned then. And that's when the missing persons report was filed for Gabby. And, you think about it and you go, yeah, of course, they're travelling the country. They're likely to dip in and out of reception. It's not something to be so alarmed about. But because they were so close, she knew that something was amiss and that this was unlike her daughter.
And when that missing persons report was made by Gabby's mum, at that point was her concern or assumption that both Gabby and Brian may be missing?
That was certainly one of her concerns, yeah. And I think because they didn't hear back from the Laundries anything really, they didn't know whether Brian himself was missing, but also it's not necessarily their duty to report them both missing. They hadn't heard from Gabby. Gabby's their daughter, therefore Gabby's missing. And I think for them, there was that initial concern, of course, about the welfare of each of them. But it pretty quickly became clear that actually Brian was okay. It was just Gabby that wasn't.
You say Brian was okay. We know that because he drove home to his parents' house in Florida. What do we know about that time? What did he tell his parents?
Yeah, that's where this story really takes a weird turn, because you would think that as her fiancé, Brian would be the most concerned about her welfare. And if she hadn't been heard from for 6 days or 10 days, however long it was, that he would be the first to raise the alarm. But actually he maintained absolute silence, deafening silence, according to the family. And they could not get any information, not out of Brian, not out of his parents. The Laundries basically hunkered down. You couldn't get a word out of them. You couldn't get any information out of them. And that to me just doesn't make sense. For the 60 Minutes stories we interviewed Brian Enton, who was one of the reporters. In fact, he covered it as extensively as any reporters covered any story. He was so thorough in his reporting. And he was sort of saying that was really unusual and that was really weird, because it's, as her fiancé, like I said, it's the person you think would have all the answers, and for him to duck and weave, it was bizarre. So yeah, there was nothing from him. And the police, this is an interesting quirk too, because there was no evidence that a crime had occurred. The police didn't have anything to go on. They couldn't charge anyone with anything. They couldn't compel anyone to be interviewed. Brian was exercising his constitutional right in Utah to not speak to police. He didn't have to speak to police. They couldn't compel him to speak to them. So they couldn't interview him about her whereabouts. They couldn't interview him about anything. What they did do, bizarrely, was set up security cameras in the neighbours' yards to try and capture any footage of him kind of coming and going. And that's where you see this awful situation where, it's hard to interpret it as anything other than them dropping the ball. Basically, they had the camera set up. Brian left the house. He walked out of the house, got into a car and drove away, never to be seen again. And they mistook him for his mother. They thought that was his mother leaving the house when actually it was Brian. So he basically slipped through their fingers, and the rest is history.
It's hard to wrap our heads around this part of the case, especially that he drove home a very long way in Gabby's van. So I think that's important too, that he arrives at his parents' house. He's completely silent. He has Gabby's van. So based on what we can interpret at that time, not only is Gabby missing, but she's also essentially homeless.
Yeah.
If she is safe, she doesn't have the home that she's had for the last 2 months. In terms of law enforcement and their options at the time, why weren't they able to question Brian at least about the van?
Well, I think it's because the way they put it was that there was no evidence of a crime. So I suppose if they were concerned that he'd stolen the van, then that could be deemed a crime, but that wasn't a concern of theirs initially. It doesn't make much sense, does it? I mean, even for me now, I still scratch my head and wonder why they wouldn't just talk to him. He was exercising his constitutional right, as I understand it. He didn't have to speak to them. And so it's bizarre to me that they can't compel him to speak in any way. But also his parents didn't speak. And that to me is also really concerning. The fact that your son would come home without his fiancé and then not speak about her, or perhaps speak about her, we don't know. And for them to remain silent. The only way that we knew that something was amiss was when Nicole, Gabby's mother, heard that the Laundries had hired a lawyer. And so for her, she was like, hang on a minute, this makes no sense at all. Why would they need a lawyer? What the hell has happened here? And so that's when we see all this movement around them filing the missing persons report, all this stuff about getting in the public eye. And I mean, as we know, as soon as that was in the public eye, it absolutely had a life of its own, and it took off with armchair detectives left, right and centre the world over, really breaking down this case, diving into all her social media posts. They'd created their own timelines based on the colour of her hair and whether her roots had grown out, what she was wearing. It was quite extraordinary. So there were all these armchair detectives in the place of actual detective work because there was very little the cops could do at that time.
How would you describe that time, especially given that role of social media? Had we ever seen anything like that before?
I'd never seen anything like that before. It's interesting because the age we live in, social media is just a part of our life. You know, in this case, it was mainly TikTok, but whether it's TikTok or Twitter or Instagram or Snapchat or whatever social media platform you choose, it was incredible to see how many people really jumped on board. I mean, there was like the hashtag Gabby Petito. And if you hit that, you were down a rabbit hole of various different takes on what happened to her, where she was, what had happened to Brian, and the breakdown in their relationship, their social media posts, the police body camera footage. So, you know, in a way, there was actually an abundance of information out there for everyone to kind of jump on and dissect. But in terms of the way that had galvanized the online population, I'd never seen anything like that before. And it just goes to show you the power of social media and the power of this sort of online community. I mean, obviously a lot of it was hot air and people had their random takes. I mean, some of it was quite ridiculous. A lot of it was quite absurd.
Conspiracy theories.
Yeah, all these conspiracy theories. And I mean, I don't know how much of that actually assists police. In fact, it probably makes their job harder because then there's all this misinformation out there as well, right? And so people are claiming that they've cited Gabby or they've cited Brian. I think at one point this poor man was photographed and everyone thought it was Brian, and then he was just like jumped on, and it wasn't Brian. It was like, man, I'm just this bloke, you know. So it can be dangerous, right, if it's not done with care. But then there was an example of it actually providing a breakthrough in the case. And we interviewed the Bethunes, who were also like a sort of a van life family, Kyle and Jen, and their kids. So they travel around the country as well in a van. And for them, that's just their life. That's what they do. And they document their life. They also have a YouTube page. They also have a website where they share with the world their experiences on the road. And so Jen was sort of detailing to us when I spoke to her, the moment they realised that they'd captured footage of Gabby's van, they were trawling through their vision going, this kind of fits the time frame that we were in Wyoming at the same time as them. Let's just look back at the vision we've captured to see on the off chance that we may have captured something. Lo and behold, they go through some of their vision, and just off to the side, left of frame, is a white van. And not a few hundred metres away from that was where Gabby's body was ultimately found. So that piece of information was pivotal for police. They obviously immediately passed that on, and then the search began around that area. And that's when Gabby's body was found. So despite all the crap that was online, all the misinformation, there was that one little piece of evidence that was useful ultimately to police and to this case.
And did that mean police were able to also place Brian at that location at that time, given that he was the one that then drove that van away from that location?
You know, I don't know about the whereabouts of the van after that. So I think for the police, it was just placing Gabby and Brian, well, certainly Gabby, at a particular location at a particular point in time. Whether or not that helped them in their case to find Brian, I couldn't really say with much authority, but I think for them it was at that point all about finding Gabby, because don't forget she was still missing then, and so there was no sign of her. So for them that was their priority.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Emma Gillespie. I'm speaking with Today Show co-host and 60 Minutes contributor Sarah Arbo about the disappearance of Gabby Petito. As you've said, this case absolutely erupted on social media at the time. Gabby did have a bit of a following of her own by the time she went missing, but why is it, do you think, this case blew up in the way that it did, you know, not just in the US, but all around the world?
I mean, I think when Gabby set out to create her online presence through YouTube and through social media, I think the objective was to bring people along for the ride, you know, to enjoy this journey with her. What that then turned into when she disappeared was a window into her life. It was a curated life, we know. You know, this was an idyllic existence that beyond the surface was actually anything but her real life. And I think what the public was able to gather from that was an insight into her as a person, what made her tick. And so I think because of the vast material that was on the public record of Gabby and of Brian, that in itself was what the public jumped on.
There's sort of like a parasocial relationship that's occurred here where we feel like we know her maybe, so we're more emotionally invested in her story because you can scroll through her Instagram and see or get a sense of who she is.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there was a recognition there that she was just like one of us. You know, she was out there enjoying life, a young woman in her prime. And so the posts that she'd put out there, it was like a window into her life, and it was something that we could relate to. And so I think for a lot of the online community, that was something that they seized, and that was something that made them feel, a sort of connection with Gabby, that they felt like they knew her a little bit, and she was this warm, bubbly, engaging person. And so automatically she kind of makes you feel happy watching her, which I think was one of her main objectives really in life. And so that came through in what she was posting. And so because of that, people felt like could relate to her. They felt like they knew her, and they felt like perhaps that gave them a greater ownership of her story and of the case, and an involvement in trying to, ultimately, actually, I feel like it was perhaps an investment that the public had in solving this case, because they felt like they maybe knew Gabby. Because there is this narrative about why did the public jump on Gabby Petito's case versus any other missing person's case. And I think it's because of the access that the public had to her, what she'd put out there. You know, you look at any other missing person's case and perhaps the same kind of information about them and their life doesn't exist. And so this was a woman who they felt like they could relate to, and somebody who they felt like they perhaps may be friends with, you know, and knew, and so therefore wanted to really invest in her story.
What was it like for Gabby's parents, obviously living this nightmare of their little girl being missing, Brian not participating in, you know, providing information, and then being missing himself? How did it impact them to see the way the global community responded to Gabby's story?
That's a big one, right? Because you don't expect that. Well, first of all, you don't expect that you're going to be the victims of crime. And then if you are, you don't expect it to make global headlines the way it did. And, you know, they'd done a little bit of media. Obviously, they'd gotten on the front foot with press conferences, and they'd released images of Gabby in the hope that somebody would have answers out there. But to see the reach that it had, I mean, even for them being interviewed by 60 Minutes Australia was like, wow, the interest is so broad. In a way, it was helpful, and they were absolutely appreciative of the efforts that the public had made to try and find their little girl. And in a strange kind of bittersweet way for them too, it was like they were able to share this beautiful child of theirs who'd grown into this young, vivacious woman with the world. The world had an insight into their girl who they adored. And so for them, there was a little bit of comfort in that. But I think it also absolutely blew them away. They weren't expecting that. I think they were completely overwhelmed by it, as you would be. You know, it's so weird, right? It's so bizarre that in this day and age that something like that would take on a life of its own.
And I've sort of heard it said, the bittersweet irony, I guess, of Gabby's footage and content and hard work and everything she posted on YouTube and Instagram, you know, eventually getting the views that she would have dreamed of and the follower count she would have aspired to.
That's right. Yeah. What she achieved in death was something she was longing for in life. And there is something kind of heartbreaking about that. But for her family, it sort of represents that she did touch people's lives and that she did have a bit of an impact. And I think they've been spurred on by that, and that's encouraged them to really keep her spirit alive. And the ultimate message here about the rest of the global community helping locate other missing persons. You know, I think, and this was really interesting and beautiful when I was speaking to Joe, Gabby's father. He was like, I wish that the world would get behind other missing people the way they got behind Gabby. I wish that they would help us find the hundreds of thousands of missing people in the world that exist right now. I wish that this would shine a light on them and their plight and help their families find answers, because, you know, on any given day there are people missing. There are people who we will never find. And if only we were, as a global community, more attuned to that in the way we were for the Gabby Petito case. I think he was yearning for something like that. And I think he's hopeful that perhaps Gabby's case does lend itself to create greater awareness for missing people and also for domestic violence more broadly.
So we've got two wide-scale national searches happening on different sides of the US at the same time. I want to go back to that breakthrough when things come to a head in the search for Gabby Petito. What can you tell me about the steps that were taken after that van was sighted, police are notified? What was discovered?
Yes, it was on the 19th of December, 300 metres from where the Bethune family had spotted Gabby's van, that police found her body. So it was about 3 months after she'd been killed that her body was found. And so they obviously had to identify the body. The remains weren't necessarily identifiable immediately. And once it had gone to the coroner, they determined that it was a homicide and that Gabby had died by strangulation. And so they were on the hunt for her killer. They only ever had one suspect, and that was Brian Laundrie, but they didn't have enough evidence to pin him down. So after finding her body, there was a warrant issued for his arrest, but it wasn't for her murder. It was for fraud. So he was wanted by police for actually using Gabby's bank cards and withdrawing money. So the charge was knowingly and with intent defrauding using one or more unauthorised access devices, namely a Capital One bank debit card and personal identification numbers. So that was what actually they wanted him on. And so that's when they ramped up the search for Brian. And so this case took another turn. And I put this to Nicole and she was like, you know what, he's not missing, he disappeared, like he ran away. And so they were calling him a coward for not fronting up to his actions. And even then, it was Brian's parents who reported him missing but weren't divulging much information beyond that. And then the search began for Brian. And then Brian's father was involved in that search. So Chris went out looking for him at the Carlton Reserve, and it wasn't until Chris became involved that then they found Brian's body.
I remember this time personally being interested in this case and following it in the media and reporting on it. And it felt so hard to keep up with, that there were so many moving parts, that we had these months of not knowing what had happened to this beautiful young woman.
Yeah.
Why wasn't her fiancé saying something? Then the tragedy of her body being discovered. Then the added mystery of the man, you know, the court of public opinion had decided had taken her life. How did Gabby's family navigate that time in terms of the intense media interest, you know, plus the social media interest alongside the heartbreaking ordeal that they were facing?
Yeah, it was absolutely heartbreaking for them, utterly earth-shattering. I mean, the emotion and the devastation was written all over their faces when we interviewed them, and it was just something that's hard to hide.
I hope that she didn't suffer and that she wasn't in any pain.
Just hoping that at that moment,
that she was in a place that she wanted to be, looking at the beautiful mountains.
It's something you never think is gonna, you see it.
You never, ever think it's gonna be yours. It's just, it's surreal.
For them, it was all about raising awareness of missing people, of domestic violence, of wanting justice. It sort of goes back to that point we were discussing earlier. It goes back to this notion that there's some comfort in the fact that the world is interested in their little girl and trying to help solve the mystery of what happened to her. So I think they found comfort, strangely, in that as a way of navigating through their pain, their grief, the awful reality of what had happened to their daughter. And they made a point of saying that no parent should ever have to bury their child, regardless of how old that child is, regardless of the circumstances of their death. In this case, it was murder. So there was malicious intent behind that. And for them, that was something that they really struggled to come to terms with. It was heartbreaking talking to them. And at the end of the day, this was a family that had lost their beautiful little girl who they adored.
Brian was finally found dead, as you mentioned, his father providing police with a location that he suspected Brian may have visited. What are the circumstances around the discovery of Brian's remains?
Yeah, well, essentially, they found skeletal remains. And so they had to identify that it was Brian, I think, through, well, obviously they can do that, scientifically, but then also the possessions that were with him when they found the remains. That was really telling because some of the items they found with him, which we can get to, was obviously the journal and what he'd written in his journal. But ultimately they found skeletal remains and a gunshot wound to the head. So that was how they determined that it was a self-inflicted gun wound, that he'd died by suicide. When you look at his journal entries, you understand that he was a man who was absolutely tormented by what had happened. He admitted to killing Gabby. He admitted to ending Gabby's life and called it a merciful murder. I mean, what is that?
Yeah.
Right? It's outrageous. And when you read it, he was sort of describing how he interpreted her emotional pain as something that couldn't be overcome, and that he was almost doing this in a way to save her from what she was experiencing and what she was going through. There's no way of justifying his behaviour, but that's how he tried to justify it himself. I suppose really those journal entries finally provided the answers that everyone was looking for. Who killed Gabby? Why was she killed? How was she killed? And then what happened to Brian?
But it seemed even with Brian, in death, in his final moments, he takes his own life, that, we can read into that it was all too much for him to bear. But through those diary entries, it's as though he's not even able to fully own what really happened because he tells this weird story about Gabby being in pain, as you've mentioned. How did that confession, or sort of lack thereof, how did that tell us what sort of a person Brian Laundrie really was, or what sort of relationship he really had with Gabby?
When we talk about coercive control, as we discussed, it's sort of one of those things where it's quite a controlling relationship. And so I think ultimately this comes full circle. He had the ultimate control in this relationship. He ended her life, in his own words. He ended her life. And then he took his own life. So at every juncture, he was in control. It speaks obviously to a mind that's not thinking clearly. I mean, I think it's a safe bet that he would have been having some of his own mental demons. This is a relationship that's been described as toxic, as dysfunctional. The fact they weren't able to see through that is a tragedy in itself. They were very young, obviously. And it tells us, I think, that this relationship was an example of coercive control in the most fatal, catastrophic way. Not only did Brian kill his fiancé, somebody he's supposed to love more than anyone else in the world, he then killed himself. So there's obviously a sense there of instability and somebody who couldn't see past that, I think, in Brian.
Brian's parents, Chris and Roberta, never really spoke out, even after Brian's death. Did they ever face any legal ramifications? I just feel like in Australia, if you had someone who facilitated this suspect in an investigation and you didn't provide information to police, that there would be outrage in the community. We can't hold Brian to account. He's dead. But is there that sense of anger towards Brian's parents to this day, do you think?
The whole thing with the Laundries was their deafening silence throughout this. They really didn't cooperate with police. They really didn't cooperate with the Petito family right up until the very end. And The main way that the Petito family was able to seek justice was through the courts. In this case, it was an emotional distress case and were awarded $3 million. And so I think for them, that was really about righting a wrong and the fact that they'd been robbed of their daughter, that she had been murdered by Brian. He was also now dead, so he can't be punished for that crime. And so this case, this emotional distress case, was a way for them to seek justice, the only way really for them to seek justice. But what they're also trying to achieve with this case is to ensure that it never happens again, in the sense that the law enforcement officers who were supposed to protect Gabby should have perhaps been better trained or should have perhaps better recognised the red flags. And so I think for them now, a main objective is that they ensure that the right kind of training is received by the officers on the ground who are dealing with family violence, whether it's, actually physical violence or more of that coercive control, which is harder to detect, but with increased awareness shouldn't be as difficult to detect.
We have heard in recent months that Gabby's parents are planning on suing those police officers in Utah who we discussed. They pulled Gabby and Brian over, they sent them on their way, and 2 weeks later we know Gabby was dead. Do you think that they have something to answer for? Is there more to it that will be revealed?
I think it does come down to training. It's one of those things. I mean, it's hard to know if this was another couple, if they'd pulled them over and treated it the same way, whether the outcome would have been different or the same. As we said earlier, I think if they had acted differently and if they had followed the protocol and put it through the court system, I mean, there's every chance that the broader community, perhaps even the Petito family, if not the Laundrie family as well, would have been awakened to the coercive, controlling nature of their relationship, of Brian asserting that kind of control over Gabby's life. If we'd been awakened to that earlier, then we would have perhaps been able to prevent her death. And so I think that's one of the objectives of perhaps pursuing the police in this way and really ensuring that this doesn't happen again, that we know better next time, that the police are able to combat something like this better and that they're able to handle it. And even just for their own peace of mind. I mean, for the officers, so we had the 2 primary officers involved, and then there was another couple, a woman and a man, I think, who were really distressed by what had happened and then were blaming themselves for the outcome. They weren't really involved in it at all, but just as sort of having witnessed it off to the side, to the peripheral, for them it was such an enormous impact on their own mental well-being that they felt this. And so I think it's about preventing that from happening for everyone involved, whether it's the victims or whether it's those dishing out the advice or the warnings or responsible for the protocol being followed through. I think it's for everyone's peace of mind that the right action is taken.
Gabby's dad, Joe, told you this is a story that needs to be heard. Does that tie into, all of this understanding of and awareness around abusive relationships, violent relationships?
Absolutely. I mean, his main goal right now is to raise as much awareness about domestic violence, about abusive relationships as he can, in concert with raising the awareness of missing persons cases generally. When I spoke to him the first time, because we spoke a number of times over the course of the stories that we did for 60 Minutes, but the very first time I spoke to him, he's like, you know what, Sarah, there's every chance that you know somebody out there who is a victim of some kind of coercive control, emotional abuse, domestic violence, but you don't know about it. There's a chance that you've got a friend out there who perhaps has a partner who is exhibiting this kind of behaviour, but you don't know about it because they don't want to speak about it. And we know that that's an issue in Australia. The amount of women that are being killed every year in this country on a weekly basis because of domestic violence, killed by somebody they know, whether it's a spouse or a family member. I mean, it's something that needs to be addressed. And I think Joe recognises that and is so hyper aware of it. And so for him, telling Gabby's story hopefully informs the public that it's not okay to be in a relationship like this, that we need to address domestic violence in all its forms to stop these kinds of deaths that ultimately are preventable, because if they're addressed early, we don't need to see people lose their lives.
Is that activism how Gabby's family are reckoning with her death, do you think? How are they moving on with their lives, finding peace, honouring her legacy?
Yeah, so they've set up the Gabby Petito Foundation, and for them the aim of that is to raise awareness about domestic violence, to raise awareness about missing persons. And I think for them, it's also about improving outreach programs so that anyone who is a victim of domestic violence has somewhere to turn and so that they don't feel alone. I think that's a big part of it. You know, this idea that you don't have anywhere to, or you feel like you've got nowhere to turn. I mean, we know that the hardest part of any domestic violence relationship for a woman is to get out. That's the hardest part. Being able to find time to actually establish a separate life, to be able to find a new home to go to, all that sort of stuff is impossible when you're in the midst of it. And so I think for him and for the Petito family broadly, the Gabby Petito Foundation stands as a bit of a safe place for people to turn when they're looking for that assistance if they're in a domestic violence situation.
Thanks to Sarah for assisting us to tell Gabby's story. If you'd like to watch Sarah's coverage of this case for 60 minutes, there's a link in the episode description. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Emma Gillespie. And if you have a case you think we should cover next, get in touch with us. You can send an email to truecrime@mamamia.com.au.